Welcome to the Dunning Africa Center, a collaboration between research institutions, universities, and businesses to study the impact of globalization and international business from an African perspective. Your platform, your voice, and your opportunity to shape the untapped potential across Africa. Together, we are asking tough questions, sparking conversations, and igniting change to reposition African business as a significant and dynamic global player. Today, we shift our focus to the central theme of this month's webinar, a focal point that will be the heart of our conversation. Our distinguished panelists and hosts are drawn from across Africa and work in business, academia, and government. Dunning Africa Center, it's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us every month as we cover the pressing questions facing African businesses today. Today's webinar, we're talking about the Common African Market and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which one will lead, of course, to the other. That is our hope. That is our hope. Now, this is really important for us because the future of Africa really, in a sense, depends upon embracing globalization, taking advantage of opportunities that globalization brings, and that can only happen by creating a single African market. And it's a conversation that has been a dream of many people. And, today we have the opportunity to talk to people who have embraced this dream wholeheartedly. These are people who have studied this issue from all kinds of angles, from specific angles, and have written about this extensively, have worked in academia, have worked in government, continue to work in government. We have the leading lights of this discussion. So, it's also part of a forthcoming book. Now, as I have probably said, and I don't want to take up all the time here, is that globalization really stands on three legs. We have the movement. It's all about movement, the key movements. And this is not new. This is the same conversation we had about the European Union and, of course, the North American Free Trade Area. And the conversation is always about movement of goods. The first leg is movement of goods and services, and then there's movement of people, and there's a movement of capital. Now, of course, my own interest has always been on the movement of capital, but these are all really key things. You can't have one without the other. That's the point. And this is where we are seeing a lot of pushback to globalization because people are not necessarily comfortable with the changes, the structural changes required for this to happen. But nonetheless, we have to move forward. We have to have a vision for the future. Now, today I'm co-hosting with a man who knows much, much more. He has forgotten more than I know about the subject, Dr. Francis Mangeni, who is everywhere. In fact, if he's a diplomat, he's an academic, he's a speaker, he's an evangelist for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the author of a forthcoming book with Andrew Mould, as well as an edited volume, which is some of the participants today are contributing to. I'm going to let him talk about it himself because, you can't summarize a man's CV like this with a few sentences. So, let me pass it on first of all. Let him introduce this panelist who he knows much better than I do. On to you, Francis.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajneesh. You said that there's always a gremlin. Well, the gremlin who stole Christmas actually has a good ending. So I'm sure we're going to have a good ending. And actually, I think we're out of the woods already. Right. So you have actually said something extremely important. You can't have one without the other, as between movement of goods, services, people, and capital. It's a continuum. They are all interlinked. And that precisely is what the AfCFTA is about. That we have got a protocol on movement of goods. We've got a protocol on services, which envisages free movement of services and people. We have got a protocol on investment, which envisages, of course, movement of capital. You can call it investment as well. Now, we have been thinking very seriously about this. It's a very strategic issue on the continent. Many stakeholders are involved. In the public sector, government officials are discussing this. It's a top priority for them at the highest political level, the heads of state and government. Industry are discussing this because they see a large market, which represents a value proposition for them. A market of 1.47 billion people, $6.7 trillion in purchasing power parity. GDP. So academia are discussing this. Lots and lots of literature coming out on this. So as Rajneesh said, with my friend Andrew Mould, we have written a book which is coming out in February next year called Borderless Africa. We really envisage a borderless Africa. And we want to make a case for the AfCFTA and to demonstrate that the AfCFTA is ultimately the solution to this, to disposing of this issue of the balkanization of Africa, but to addressing the issue of breaking up Africa into 55 small, disparate countries, one big economy that is actually viable. So that book is on the way. And then we have another edited volume, which has 29 chapters on how the AfCFTA, through its protocols, which already paved the way for movement of goods, services, people, and capital, already staged the ground for the common African market. Because as you know, a common market basically is characterized by movement of goods, services, people, and capital. So the AfCFTA, in having these protocols, has already paved the way to having the common African market. It actually, if you were to answer the question, can the AfCFTA deliver the common African market? The answer would be a yes, it's already doing so. We only need to consolidate the process. So that's why we have got now 3 panelists who have contributed chapters to that edited volume, whom I'm now very pleased to introduce. Firstly, we have got Muhammad Ali, my good friend and brother, Muhammad Ali, who is the director of Trading Goods and Competition at the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, based in Accra, Ghana. But right now, he's going to be talking to us from Dar es Salaam, where he's facilitating a meeting of the Ministers of Trade, as well as a conference on advancing the protocol on women and youth in trade. So we couldn't have a better person really to speak to us about the AfCFTA itself on this. And being a director for trading goods, he really is going to tell us about how the protocols on trading goods, the protocol on trading goods and its annexes positioned to help us get into the common market. Right. And then next, we have got Professor Alan Hirsch, who is not only a political activist. He was a key player in the struggle against apartheid, right? But he's also an academic, right? So he's with the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, and he has got a huge project across the world on movement of persons. He has really distinguished himself as a go-to person when it comes to movement of persons. So he's going to tell us about pathways forward to getting to where we need to be on movement of persons. And then Dr. Marisela Ouma, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and Assistant General Counsel or Legal Counsel in the Central Bank of Kenya. She helped in establishing the Copyright Board in Kenya. And she has really distinguished herself as an expert in intellectual property and innovation across the continent and indeed across the world. So these are the panelists that we have today who are going to help us answer the key questions which we're discussing today. Now, could I turn this back now to Rajneesh so that we can have the interventions before we embark into the discussion?
The gremlins aren't completely gone. Unfortunately, it turns out that my mouse has decided to die. Everything has a lifetime, and today it seems, a RIP mouse. But there you go. Yes, thank you. Francis, for introducing everyone. And it's my pleasure to join this event. I have to start off, of course, and people who know me, we have some regulars in the audience who know that I function well as a skeptic about everything. Not necessarily in part because it's good to have a discussion, and that's the spirit in which you should take this. It's not because I want to challenge the status quo at every time, but it's simply a good way to start a conversation. Let's turn around to this conversation, the three legs of globalization, and where we are going to go with the common African market. Now, again, for the audience, I grew up in Nigeria, so one of the previous African Continental Free Trade Area webinar we had, I played the role of skeptic quite thoroughly, in part because Nigeria is a country which manages to always throw a spanner in the works, and so I kept on bringing up and this is a problem, is what you call a selection bias, because Nigeria seems to be an outlier in many things nowadays when it comes to these issues. But I think this is interesting as well, that we have to sort of bring together 55. It's like an orchestra, bringing 55 or 54 people to play instruments in symphony, in synchronicity is a challenge. And so I think what we want to start off with is asking our panel members, what's the state of play? Let me start with you, Mohammed. What's the state of play when it comes to trade? Over to you.
No, thank you so much. And maybe that would be, I would assume, the easiest question for me today. I've been asked this question many times. I prefer to maybe try this time around to address it in a different way. For those who don't know, maybe something about me, I was chief negotiator for Egypt, who negotiated this agreement together with my colleagues at that time. We had the vision of our founding fathers for the African Union and Abuja treaty in the back of our mind while we were drafting the different articles and objectives of the AfCFTA, and specifically the future role of the AfCFTA and where the AfCFTA can go and where the AfCFTA can take us. So speaking directly about the numbers, we have 46 state party. And for those who don't know as well, there is a 55 member state of the African Union where all of them, they have the right to be a state party for the AfCFTA, and being a state party require them to ratify and their parliament ratify. And once that happen, they are considered as a state party for the AfCFTA. When it comes to trading goods, as we speak today, as Dr. Francis said, I'm currently in Dar es Salaam in a meeting for the Council of Ministers. If you asked me this question yesterday, I will tell you we have 42 countries who submitted their schedule of tariff concession that is according to the agreement. If you ask me the question now, that number increased from 42 to 45. The most significant fresh news I can say that happened just 2 hours from now is the conclusion and the decision of the Council of Ministers to adopt the tariff offer or the schedule of tariff concession from Ethiopia. That is the first time in maybe in any multilateral trade arrangement that Ethiopia commit a significant amount of their tariff lines to be liberalizing over 90% over 10 years, and starting from 2021. So in terms of numbers, in terms of membership, in terms of tariff concessions, I think we are in a very, very, very good track. 45 out of 46 state party. That is a very significant achievement when it comes to trading goods. However, for the implementation, we need to realize maybe a few factors when we speak about that. The agreement calls for progressive elimination of tariff, progressive liberalization of trade and service. The word progressive has been used to describe how the agreement can realize its full potential. Currently, as we speak now in 2023, we are in the third year of tariff liberalization. Another factor that we need to take in consideration when the agreement entered into force and when the Council of Ministers formed and the Secretariat formed, and we realized that the agreement entered into force in June 2019. 6 months later, we were in the peak and in the middle of COVID-19. There was an attempt to maybe fast track the process in January 2021, when our heads of state and government met virtually for the first time in the history of the African Union, met virtually specifically for the AfCFTA and announced the start of trade in January 2021. As expected, that political push, I think, the private sector were not able also to build upon in the way that was hoped for, and that was due to the lack of some maybe key infrastructural when it comes to maybe trade documents, when it comes to awareness among the custom officials on the AfCFTA, many other issues. So we managed in 2022, in June 2022, to look in the tariff concessions of 29 countries. At June 2022, we managed to look in the tariff concession from 29 countries. And maybe the philosophy in that is, if we can't have full implementation, if we can fly, let's run. If we can't run, let's walk. We started with 2021, which invoked other countries, and we ended up now with 45 countries. We launched that in June 2022. We launched the Guided Trade Initiative in October 2022, and the reason for the Guided Trade Initiative were to make sure that trade actually can happen under the AfCFTA, and the AfCFTA framework is actually have the adequate enabling environment for the trade. As we speak now, and where is the trade? We have 7 countries who traded, but after that, they continued. We learned that maybe Tanzania in October 2022, they participated in the Guided Trade Initiative with 1 trade. Currently now they have more than 20 trade that happen outside of the Guided Trade Initiative. Similar to Kenya, the numbers in double digit. Ghana and Egypt, they created the first 2 trade aggregating companies and AfCFTA trading companies, where they have contract among themselves to exchange trade between Ghana and Egypt, which will allow substantial, maybe sustainable and more sustainable trade relation between the 2 countries. That progress in the first batch invoked countries like, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, and Central Africa, invoked those countries and say, why not us? Why we were not included? We want to be part of the Guided Trade Initiative. And we have seen significant push from the private sector over the government of those countries to participate in the Guided Trade Initiative. And in fact, I can say now that South Africa and Nigeria, as the 2 biggest economy in Africa, they are in very, very late stage of joining the trade under the AfCFTA. So I'll stop here, and that is the status that I wanted to share.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things, and forgive me for going off in a slightly different direction. Trade is often, people use a gravity model that you tend to trade with people next door to you, or not, and that's one of the things that we've always noticed, that there's very little trade between, let's say, within ECOWAS. ECOWAS has existed for a very long time, but the trade between the ECOWAS countries is actually a small percentage of the trade but it is still the most important form of trade, and that's what we're seeing, I think, in East Africa. East African countries have tended to trade amongst themselves quite a lot, as we see in Southern Africa and North Africa. We have a regional thing. So I mean, I'm wondering to what extent it's important, that Ghana talks more to Nigeria, and they work out how to let goods flow, rather than between Ghana and Egypt, which, to be frank, is not the main artery of trade. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, actually, definitely, this is a very good maybe point to highlight, and this is actually was one of the key essence of the AfCFTA itself, and we noticed that on the ground, on the guided trade initiative, as you rightfully said, the way that our regional economic communities, that is building block for the AfCFTA, is designed around the geographical location of our different countries, and in many cases, those geographical locations, or the countries that belong to the same geographical locations, they tend to produce the same products and trade maybe in a very narrow array of products. For example, in East Africa, even though we are providing East Africa as a good example, and they are a good example, however, the majority of the countries produce the same thing: coffee and tea, plus maybe other items. In the West, it is the same. You can find like 70% of the cocoa producers, which is Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they are next to each other in the same block. So maybe the comparative advantage between the countries that is in the same geographical location is not there, or if it is there, it is very, very minimal. But when we create the AfCFTA, it is for the first time the East African tea can be experienced in the West. We witnessed in the guided trade initiative the trade in, for example, for car batteries from Kenya to Ghana, and people in Ghana, or the private sector in Ghana, they were not aware that such capabilities existing in Kenya. So we are trying to shake things a little bit in the perception and provide alternative ways of trade other than the already existing channels or the already existing trade relation with the rest of the world. Trade diversion and trade creation, both of them we are targeting under the AfCFTA, or the philosophy of the AfCFTA is targeting the two models.
So let me follow up with one more question and then move on to Alan. So the tariff barriers certainly it's an important step in the process. What about the non-tariff barriers, which, again, the Nigerian story comes up. The problem is not, in ECOWAS has always been the non-tariff barriers. What's the state of play? Is there any protocols or processes to smooth this out?
Well, definitely, as you rightfully said, if I can give maybe percentage on how the tariff barrier and non-tariff barrier can affect the intra-Africa trade rates, I think non-tariff barrier can affect more than 70% or can account for more than 70% of the reasons of the low intra-Africa trade among our countries. We developed a digital portal for recording the non-tariff barriers, where the private sector can report the non-tariff barriers that they are facing. And we created the subcommittees to address that. And we created, for the first time, a dispute settlement mechanism that can deal with that. But again, all of that are policy tools. And we are not the first trade agreement that do such tools. It is all about how these tools is being implemented, built upon, and enhanced. What I can say, that we will not be able to capture or think about it this way. Our tariff solution for under the AfCFTA is like a net, and the wider this net you throw in the sea, which is the intra-Africa trade, the wider that net, and once you start seeing that trade system is being implemented across Africa, you will be able to capture more non-tariff barriers and address them in the AfCFTA way. So yes, while I understand that the non-tariff barrier plays more significant role or we should focus more on the non-tariff barrier, we cannot start a real or serious work on the non-tariff barrier unless we see the market access agenda move forward.
I think immediately there's a question that I think is from the audience, which I think I'll bring into play now, where Dimitris asks, what happens when the crucial dates come and a country does not remove the barriers, etc.? What are the teeth what are the teeth of the trade agreement? Are there any sticks as well as carrots to encouraging the de facto implementation of the
Well, definitely there is legal precautions. There is a dispute settlement mechanism that has been designed to resolve country-to-country conflicts and country-to-country commitment under the agreement, and that dispute settlement mechanism does not report or does not or is not subject to any political interference. So the appellate body under the dispute settlement mechanism, their decision is legally binding on the member state by the agreement and is not subject to any interpretation by any political body. There is another configuration, which is the African Union configuration. It is, again, we need to realize that the AfCFTA configured as one of the organs or one of the key projects of the African Union, and we have seen before that the African Union used the sanctions against maybe some countries who have some political unrests, or even in many cases due to some financial maybe or missing their financial commitments. So the thesis is there, but from our side in the AfCFTA, we are not trying to think about that critically now. While we are trying to create the market, we are trying to bring everyone together. We are trying to bring the countries that is dragging their feet in the market instead of just threatening them. I think we are trying to have more constructive approach.
So we start off with honey, and then we move to the vinegar and the sticks later on. No, it's a completely sensible approach. I agree with you. Let's move on to Alan, and the second, the key, actually the most controversial leg is the movement of people. Alan, I know Alan is struggling with gremlins in Cape Town as well. He's on his phone, and again, a man who knows more than I will ever know. But now, let's. Tell us what the state of play on the movement of people.
Okay, I've just unmuted myself, I think successfully. Yeah, thank you very much. It's also an honor and a pleasure for me to be involved in this really important conversation. And thank you to the Dunning Africa Center for organizing it. And, you know, I want to draw attention to the book that Francis talked about earlier that we've written on towards a common market. Now, you know, Rajneesh, in a discussion before, you mentioned to me that, you know, how can we make progress in a context where globally anti-foreigner and anti-immigration sentiment is strong, and how are we making progress in Africa? I think that is a factor in Africa. I'm in Cape Town, or near Cape Town, as you mentioned. the South African government 2 weeks ago brought out a new white paper on immigration, citizenship, and the protection of refugees, called, ironically, the protection of refugees. What it's actually doing, if it is implemented, and I'm not sure that it will be to make access to South African citizenship more difficult and to make refugee circumstances much more difficult. So make it much more difficult for people to apply for asylum and make it much more difficult for people who are applying for asylum and who even get asylum to have access to various social and economic rights. So there are some countries in Africa which are, digging their heels in when it comes to certain aspects of immigration. But at the same time, South Africa is moving forward in bilateral relationships with Kenya, with Ghana, 2 new agreements, visa-free travel for visitors. I believe Uganda's in the pipeline. South Africa is part of SADC, where virtually every SADC country can visit virtually every other SADC country without a visa. So there is some progress, but at a continental level, unlike the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the Free Movement of Persons Protocol, which was agreed to by heads of state at the same meeting that the Free Trade Agreement was agreed to, has only been ratified by 4 countries. And unlike the nearly 50 countries that have ratified the Free Trade Agreement. So at a continental level, it's problematic. And there's several reasons for that. You talked about this symphony of 55 nations, how difficult it is. I think it's particularly difficult on those kinds of issues to have a process moving forward that rapidly. There are fears about economic migration from poorer countries to richer countries. There are fears about the access to social services in the richer countries that poorer people from poorer countries might want to get to. But there is progress. If the African Development Bank has been bringing out a African Visa Openness Index since 2016, and virtually every year since 2016, there have been considerable improvements. They have indices of visa openness, and some countries are completely open, and a number of countries are very open, or they have visa on arrival or relatively straightforward access to e-visas, and that is progressing. So it's a difficult situation to do at a continental level, but at a unilateral level, at a bilateral level, at a plurilateral level, in the sense of small groups of countries that aren't necessarily regional economic communities, but also at the regional economic community level, there is significant progress taking place. It's just not fast enough, and it's not moving as quickly as the trade processes are moving.
Yeah, no, I think that people is always a challenge. I mean, this is, I was reading a completely, almost tangential story about the banning of Ghana Must Go bags by airlines. I think Ethiopian Airlines has banned them. And I remember the history of the Ghana Must Go bags, which goes back to the 1970s, for those of you who are quite young. When Nigeria decided that there were too many Ghanaians in Nigeria, and then summarily sent everyone home, or tried to send everyone home. But there is always this danger, of course, that people feel that foreigners are reducing their income level. We had the same thing in the UK. The British government is very keen on sending people to Rwanda, which ironically is, maybe the United Kingdom can join the common African market as well, since they've left the EU. I think that's actually a very poetic solution to the whole problem. But anyway, that's a little bit not on the topic. While in principle there is, the question is making this work. Yeah, while in principle there may be free movement, and Francis mentions in the chat function that yes, ECOWAS has in principle a free movement of persons. The fact of the matter that it becomes less clear in reality. What mechanisms do you perceive? I mean, will this be a regional process that the bigger countries should lead? How are we going to make progress on this de facto as opposed to de jure, which is of course we can legislate everything?
I don't think, I think it's important that the bigger countries play a big role. And so, for example, in East Africa, where there is already a lot of progress, as Francis points out, and in ECOWAS, Kenya has, the president of Kenya announced a couple of weeks ago that there was going to be visa-free access for all Africans to Kenya by the end of the year. But I think we need to make a distinction between visa-free access and the freer movement of persons. The freer movement of persons consists of three levels. Essentially, being able to visit without a visa for 3 months, then being able to establish oneself. So essentially there are rights to visit, there are rights to work, and there are rights to establish yourself and to live in a country and to start their own business. And that is happening in some countries. So I mentioned that it's happening at various levels within the East African community, which consists of 7 or 8 countries. It seems to be growing quite rapidly. But within it, there are 3 countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, which have liberalized much more. So it's relatively straightforward for a Kenyan to go to Uganda, to apply for a job, to be allowed to build a house, to be allowed to start a business, and similarly for reciprocal relationships for the other 2 countries. So there is progress happening at that level. There's a lot of progress happening at the bilateral level. So, for example, there was recently an agreement between Botswana and Namibia to allow the people from each country to cross borders without passports, in fact. They just have to have that ID document. And that's also the case in that small grouping of East African countries. They can travel with ID documents alone. There are unilateral processes. So there are 3 countries in Africa, the Gambia, Seychelles, and Benin, where any African can visit without a visa, as long as they don't have some sort of criminal record or as long as they have a valid passport. And the 2 other countries, Rwanda and Kenya, are following, they say, by the end of this year. So there is progress happening, and I think that we can return to a continental process. And I can talk about that in more detail. But even though we're a little bit frustrated in terms of the continental process, there are opportunities for unilateral, bilateral, plurilateral, and regional economic communities to move forward more quickly than you can at a continental level with 55 countries. No other continent of 55 countries has come close to opening up in the way that we are planning to do. It's a large, very large and complex continent, and countries at one end of the continent often have relatively little relationship and little understanding. Maybe they don't even have access to the language of a country at the other end of the continent. So that will happen. But I'd like to make some suggestions about how to move it forward at a continental level. But even though there are suggestions at a continental level, there are many levels in which it is happening. And unlike some other parts of the world, like the UK, for example, where the immigration minister resigned this morning, I believe, Robert Jenrick. And it's understandable. It's a really hard job that he's got. Unlike that situation, we are actually moving forward in most parts of Africa, but not at a continental level systematically.
We'll come back in the next round to asking the way forward. I'm going let's first just see the state of play. I think that's really the key story, looking forward to see what are the next steps. But Marcella has been sitting very patiently, and I just have to compliment her on the fact that she's still with us, despite the fact that it's been a while since we kicked off. Now, collaboration, for me, of course, a common African market and a free trade, this is all about collaboration. And I'm the first to talk about the importance of innovation. And, innovation is a driver of economic development. There's no two ways about it. And innovation requires collaboration. There's this whole idea of scientists and people sitting in alone and coming up with new ideas is so 17th, 18th century. The only way innovation really functions is when people work together. And Marcela is going to tell us tell us what the state of play is when it comes to innovation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. In terms of innovation, there's various things that we need to look into. And it's unfortunate that when we look at the continent, we find that the levels of innovation are pretty low compared to other regions of the world. So for instance, if we look just briefly glance at the innovation index, we find that the highest ranking country that we have in the continent comes 45, 45th in the global index innovation. And some of the things that they normally look into is issues like intellectual property receipts, market sophistication. And I think this is something that the AfCFTA is seeking to look into in terms of even what my predecessors have spoken about, trade in goods and services. The intangible asset intensity. And you find that quite a number of these parameters are very difficult for most of the developing countries within the region to deal with. But over and above that, I think it's important to just look at the innovation ecosystem holistically. And I guess like now, when we look at the laws, we are looking at the enabling laws and regulations that have been put in place as well as policies. And at the moment, I think we have the AU STI, the science and technology policy, which basically is supposed to look into various ways to encourage us to deal with various issues of innovation. Then we have various governance structures. And this one's basically, we're going to look at the various RECs, if you're looking at it, whether you're looking at it from the West African part of the continent or the Southern Africa or the Eastern Africa, what systems have been put in place to be able to deal with innovation. And then you have the issues of access to finance. And I'm thinking right now, this is one of the biggest problems. I think last week we just concluded the Kenya Innovation Week. And one of the biggest problems that came up in terms of, for instance, just the startups was the issue of finance and access to finance. And then supportive research. As you said, one of the things that we're working on, if you just take, like, for instance, the pandemic that we got out of a couple of years ago, you find that we have various research institutions and there are very many innovative ideas that are coming through. But the problem is that we work in silos. So you find that there's a research center in Cameroon. They're dealing with innovative issues, but they'll just deal with them in Cameroon, or you go to Ghana and they'll be dealing with a specific issue in Ghana. You come to Kenya, and there's the need to come and have this collaborative framework where all these institutions speak to each other and support innovation. The same thing again when you're talking about the startups. You find that many of them, they'll come up with very good ideas in terms of innovation, but they cannot put them out to market by virtue of the fact that they do not have access to the supportive structures as well as the finance mechanisms. And then the issue of markets, and I think that's one of the areas that the AfCFTA, if you're looking at that particular trade area and a common market, it's the potential of having such a huge, it's actually a huge market for most of the innovative ideas and things that we come up with. For instance, if I just asked a couple of people, how many of the people have heard of the Kira Motors from Uganda? And this is something that anytime we think about motor vehicle manufacturing, they've come up with the electric buses and everything. But this is, I mean, if you're to imagine somebody in Kenya, for instance, they need to get buses, they'll probably go and look for them from China or wherever it is, as opposed to coming back and dealing with them from this particular market. So you find that we do have the markets, but the question is, how do we put the things out to the market? And I think these are some of the structures that we need to put in place to ensure that we have these collaborative frameworks and access to markets as well. Then we have the infrastructure, and I think this is very important because it allows for the movement of goods and services, despite the fact that we've moved into the digital economy, because even that needs infrastructure. We need to have good internet access. We need to be able to deal with the digital goods in a proper way. But more so when we're looking at innovation, I think the focus would be more on intellectual property. How does intellectual property support innovation? And you find that, as I said, we have very few, I think intellectual property for a very long time is put in the back burners. And you find that, yes, we have like the two main regional intellectual property organizations in Africa. And you find that they only take like, I think the one, again, we've been balkanized. You have the French speaking, which is OAP, and then you have ARIPO. All of them combined have less than they don't have the 50 member states. I mean, around, I think it's 49 because you have 17 and 22. And yet, that's 39, sorry. And yet you find that the major economies, if you're to take South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, they're not members of these particular regional organizations that deal with IP. And IP is basically territorial. So you find that in terms of moving things, like the consignment that came from Kenya to go to Ghana, basically did it have any IP that was, was it under a particular trademark or, trade in goods and services? So I think in terms of technology, there's a need for us to be able to harness the existing innovative systems, because many people will say that innovation in Africa is relatively low. But I beg to differ. It happens in various sectors. It's just that we haven't commercialized it. And the parameters that we normally use for innovation are more suited for the Western market, as opposed to having innovative solutions for our own problems. Just a quick example I'd give you is I found this very fascinating. There's this Vaxi box. We have an issue of electricity, getting access to the power grid in the continent. I guess less than 30% have access. Yet we have vaccines and other things that need to be taken to different places. So you find that the people like this Vaxi box have come up with a solar-powered refrigerator, which it can be used for purposes of vaccines. So you find that we actually do have innovation coming up. And fortunately for them, they were able to protect the intellectual property. Of course, the system sometimes can take long for you to be able to deal with the systems. So they went and dealt with what you call the utility models first before they move into the whole patenting systems. So I think intellectual property to a certain extent does encourage innovation because it gives you that, would I say, confidence that there's something, there's a property in this and it's protected and I'm able to trade across in terms of the goods and services. So I think for the state of play, that's basically what I'd say, Prof.
That's very enlightening. Thank you so much. The conversation, I've not only had this conversation in this environment. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was involved with a large project out with a number of people out of Cape Town, Rafi Kaplinski's crowd. And we were talking of course, innovation systems is a big thing, a big conversation going on at the academic level, but understanding the challenges of what science and technology, innovation, science and technology mean in an African context is different from you cannot go around using exactly the same frameworks. Now, one of the things also that came up in a fairly recent trip I made to Bangladesh was that IPRs, intellectual property rights, having the ability to have a property right is important. But the problem is not so much about the legislation about the IPR, it's about the enforcement. And that you may have the IPR, but then getting someone to enforce it, the state doesn't have the capacity to necessarily enforce it. And again, jumping countries, I was talking to someone out of Pakistan, and he told me that there were only two judges who knew enough to legislate on IPR infringement in the whole country. So there was a waiting list for action, which would be 2 or 3 years before you would actually get your turn to get. So I think there's there's two things I want to bring up. One is there's a bottleneck in terms of enforcement of IPR. And that's something that certainly should be of interest we need to address that at some level. And the second, of course, and the really good point that I like is this idea that we have all the research institutes producing excellent research, publishable research, but it doesn't move from one country to another. So I think we'll come back to this, Francis, in the next round, really. What are the next steps? How are we going to encourage, how are we going to deal with these two bottlenecks? Maybe you want to say a few words before we go on to the next round, Marcella.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. I mean, that's actually very true. On the issue of enforcement has always been, I think, a major problem. And I think, again, there are many facets when you're looking at it. So if you're looking at it in terms of the law enforcement agencies, it's true you find that quite a number of them, IP is a relatively new subject to them. But I think there's progress being done in that particular area. So you find that there are all these colloquia for judges and magistrates. And if I give an example, when I was working at the Copyright Office, we had cases which would be thrown out because, like, let's say if there was a criminal matter that had been brought forward, first of all, even right from the prosecution, they'd be saying we have more serious issues to deal with than IP infringement. So you find that is something that as time goes by with the education that's coming up, then it's taken more seriously. And then there's also another issue of societal attitudes, or is it culture? Because of the intangible nature of the intellectual property, it's normally very difficult to convince people that the infringement is actually an infraction on somebody else's rights. So those are some of the things that we have to look into when you're talking about enforcement. And also just the clear understanding of IP is a property like any other, despite the fact that it's intangible. So that those are some of the things that, I totally do agree. And then I think the other thing I'd also wanted to add is the whole issue of from research to product or process, or, one of the things is that we are very good at academic research, as you said it, and we don't bother to go the step further. Either we don't have the capacity to do that, or we do not know how to go about it. Or sometimes you find that our research results are taken up by somebody else and they run with it. So those are some of the issues that we need to look at when you're looking at all these different issues. Yeah.
That's a very good. I just want a quick anecdote. A few years ago, I was invited to CERN, the people who do the smash atoms in Switzerland. It's the largest research, arguably in the world, collaborative research project in the world. And they produce, I don't know how many hundreds of patents every year. They're the largest single producer of patents on the planet. And they called me in and said, we want to commercialize this. That we have all of this knowledge, but we have no revenue from this knowledge. They were generating less than $20 million a year from all their patents. Whereas NASA, which produced a quarter of the patents that CERN produces, was generating 700 million from their patents, and they were not able to commercialize. In fact, so the problem isn't necessarily unique to Africa. This was in Geneva that I was having this conversation, and of course, part of the problem was that the people in the commercialization unit were actually scientists, not business people. So they didn't have the first idea of how to commercialize. They knew how it worked. They were very happy to explain to me how things worked, but they were not able to think about the practical side. So it's a different sort of thing. But let's, we're having questions coming in, and I want to give some chance to air these questions. Mohammed, there are two questions that have popped up with your name, so to speak, on them. The first one of them was, I don't know if you've seen it, but you maybe want to comment on there's one by Mark Pearson, I believe, which is definitely for you to comment, as well as comment on perhaps you can, because my mouse is absent, I'm trying to multitask, and it's more challenging than I thought. And then there was so there's a MFN question, and then there was and Mark brought up something. Let's start with MFN question since I found it. What was the thinking behind the most favored nation provision in the agreement and in the agreement and the trade in goods protocol? It does not seem to have the basic elements of other MFN provisions, and state parties are allowed to discriminate against each other in favor of third parties outside the FTA. This is for you, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe let me start by saying I'm not necessarily agree that it is missing the core element of the MFN provisions, maybe in other multilateral arrangements like the WTO or other trade agreements. The first thing I want to say, maybe when it was time for negotiation, we not necessarily we were going by the book on what have been done previously, because what have been done previously in many cases has been proven to not work specifically for the smaller economies and for the least developed countries. So that is the first thing. The second point I want to make is, or the question we're asking, what was the thinking or what was the background? The background is you are dealing with 55 countries in a continent where we have more than 39 least developed countries, and you are dealing also with a situation where we have already existing regional economic communities. We already have existing trade arrangement and trade preferences that is there. So the idea were to take stock on where we at the time of the signing of the agreement, what have been done before. Countries have the opportunity and the right to preserve what has been done before, and that should be, or the state parties of the AfCFTA should be given a fair chance to negotiate or to be afforded opportunities to negotiate the preferences granted before the entry of the agreement into force. But when it comes to what will happen after the agreement entered into force, actually, the most favored nation Article 4.2 gives a right to a member state to engage other or third parties. We call them third parties in the agreement, as long as whatever they are going to agree will not maybe impede or frustrate the objective of the protocol or the objective of the agreement, and such concessions or privileges will be granted to or extended to other state parties. So this is actually 4.2. This is where I disagree, maybe slightly disagree with the question that it doesn't have the core principle of the other MFN. Actually, no, it has member states who will enter in trade arrangements after the entry into force, after the agreement came to existence, will be under the obligation of extending such preferences. What happened before is where we have a slightly different approach, that it will be based on negotiations, based on maybe a fair opportunity for the member state to negotiate such preferences. So yes, I will stop here, and I'm ready for the next question.
Yeah. So I think Mark is asking about, so free trade agreement encourages trade of originating goods. We're still having challenges in agreeing rules of origin in important goods, such as Chapter 87 and textiles and garments. Is there progress being made?
Yes, the short answer, there is a progress that has been made. The Council of Ministers has been engaging over the last 2 years, specifically on automotive and textile. We have seen breakthrough in many areas in automotive and textile. There is assumption that all automotive and all textile is still outstanding, which is not true. For example, there was a historical decision where the Council of Ministers announced it, for example, for the second-hand clauses or for the used clauses, there will be the rule of the AfCFTA will say there will be no trade under the AfCFTA preferential regime under that particular heading, which basically we are saying AfCFTA is not open for business when it comes to second-hand clauses from outside Africa or even from Africa. So that was a decision. There was another decisions recently on Chapter 62, giving preference or giving more emphasis on the need of usage of African cotton and materials that we have in Africa. But usually textile in any trade agreement is one of those areas where you can see it take more time. And the specific reason for Africa, when it comes to textile, for example, we have cotton producers in Africa. We have producers for other materials. Not all textile are cotton, but the real question now, is it easy for us to move those materials around Africa? I think the answer is no. We are still having a significant gap in infrastructure, in trade-related infrastructure, and addressing the matter by policy tools alone is not sufficient. So the debate usually between those countries who already established easy access to the inputs from outside Africa, and they wish to continue benefit from such relation when they go to the AfCFTA. On another hand, there is another team who says, unless we force ourselves to use maybe the inputs from Africa, we will not go anywhere, and we will continue have only one or single transformation process, which is not significant or not up to what we are looking for under the AfCFTA. So it is 2 points of view. One point of view say we are not there yet. Other point of view, we say we should force ourselves. So that is why we are still having back and forth, of course, depending on what level of development we are speaking about. We are seeing countries with stronger base of industrialization or stronger industry base are rooting for more sophisticated process when it comes to textile, while other countries who wish to start to be in that process calling for more maybe easier process at the beginning. Same thing for automotive. There was a significant breakthrough where the Council of Ministers adopted a general rule for automotive, which is the rule of 60% value of non-originating material and 40% of local content. While there is some requests from countries to have exception for such rule, allowing more flexibility that will allow them to establish their own industrial policy when it comes to automotive. We have countries like South Africa and Morocco where they can achieve significant amount or significant percentage of the car, 70% and 60%, while there is other countries that wish to see maybe more opportunity for them to maybe to start their automotive industries. And I will not mention the name of the countries, but that is their vision. What we are trying to say, if you are speaking about single market, you cannot think about what Morocco can produce alone, what Rwanda can produce alone. You need to think about what is the whole continent can collectively produce. And again, that is back and forth between different level of development, not necessarily disagreement, but everyone is looking for their national maybe policies when it comes to automotive and when it comes to textile.
Yes, no, thank you. That's very enlightening. One of the questions that I haven't addressed, and I want to bring it up, but I also realize we're keeping an eye on time, and we haven't come to the next step of the conversation. We're coming to the next steps to the conversation. But Arthur in the chat said, seeing that there is no live and representative data on the small business ecosystem in Africa, how certain are we that this policy is addressing the real needs of African business? I have to say this is a very important point, that we are thinking in terms of big issues, and things that big companies can take advantage of, and state-owned enterprises and so forth. But the small and medium enterprises, which dominate the continent, are not being addressed. Now, I want to come back to this conversation. Let me combine them together. Francis, we only have over 15 minutes left, but I would think we should go through and make this integral in the question of looking forward. What are the next steps? but I'd like each one of you to comment, keeping in mind the SME, who is the core and the heart. Without them, there is no real African free trade area. There is no common market unless the small man, the small business, small woman, businesswoman gets involved in. So back now over to you, Francis.
Right. Thank you very much, Rajneesh. So I'm going to maybe ask Mohammed to make a comment on that. But before I do so, on the role of the small bear, right, who are the majority, in fact, I would like to recognize that we have got a number of chapter contributors. You remember this book I talked about on the Common African Market on this call. We have got Mark Pearson, who actually posted a question, which Mohammed has helped to respond to. We have got Bruce Byers, we have got Michael Cotto, Magdalene Maurejoy, we have got Rosalind, and we have got Victor Amadi also, who have contributed chapters. So if you would like colleagues who have contributed to this book to say anything, please just put up your hand and we shall be very happy to give you the floor so that you make an intervention. But beginning from where Mohammed left off, this issue of accumulation is extremely important. He didn't mention, he used the word accumulation, but the point he was making is that we need local content in our products in order to promote industrialization. The AfCFTA basically tries to promote made in Africa products. But now that doesn't mean that a product has to be made in one country. Inputs can come from any other African country, and inputs from any other African country will be considered as local inputs. They will contribute towards the computation of local content. This helps us to promote value chains, regional value chains, in that products will more easily qualify to be made in Africa and for preferential treatment when the inputs are sourced from other African countries. I hope, and I would like to just point out that during the breakthrough on rules of origin for automotives, which of course still need to be confirmed, our director Mohammed made a very important intervention or presentation, making this point. And after he made this point, people saw that it was actually feasible to have a continental, an African regional value chain in the automotives sector. I was very pleased to hear that. So briefly, Mohammed, would you like to say something about this before we move to the other questions?
Can I just say I hope to keep interventions short so we get everyone to talk and allow people to go for dinner at exactly 6 o'clock, whichever time.
We have got just about over 45 minutes, over 15 minutes.
It will be short. Dr. Francis, I think you are absolutely right. I didn't want to go in details and technical details about the reasons and what is the arguments on the table, but cumulation actually is there as a concept, and it is not only a concept. The AfCFTA itself, the end goal is economic integration. So cumulation is the way that we are, or the idea that we are pushing. You don't need to be the last country that put stamp and say made in Morocco or made in South Africa or made in Botswana. You can contribute in the value chain by leather product, by any other component in the manufacturing of a car, and that be an African car. And being an African car, you can assemble car in Ghana, and Ghana contribute only 10%, but the remaining 30% for them, they can source from Morocco and they can source from South Africa, and instead of sourcing it from outside Africa, and they can still benefit from the market access that is being provided under the AfCFTA. So that is the idea. It will take time before it resonates in everyone's mind, speaking about the maybe the policymakers. But when it comes to private sector, what you also maybe what I can add, that we created a continental automotive strategy that goes beyond the trade policy, that goes for finance, that goes for a continental procurement to achieve the accumulation, go to multiple layers. So that's why it's taking time. Right. So I will stop here.
Yeah. So that's a very powerful point, and I can see Mark agrees with this. Right, though Bruce is lamenting something in the chat box. Right, now let me move on to this question on the MFN clause. The colleague was asking for the explanation why we ended up with this kind of MFN clause, heavily qualified. The simple answer is that we wanted to avoid free riding. So that's why we said we shall have the MFN clause, but it is subject to reciprocity. So in other words, for you to benefit from the MFN clause, you should also meet us halfway. You should also open up your markets. And it should be, Bruce, you're not lamenting, all right, getting excited as the discussion is good. If you want to make an intervention, I'll give you a chance to do so. Right. So this was the explanation, and there's practice on how actually these qualified MFN clauses operate. COMESA, for instance, has got this version of a qualified MFN clause, and it has worked perfectly well. Nevertheless, next year, 2024, we shall have the first 5-year mandatory review of the AfCFTA. Maybe we shall clean up these MFN clauses better. Because if you look at the different versions in the protocol on trading goods, the protocol on trading services, maybe they need to be reconciled so that there's a bit of harmony between them. Now, on innovation, the innovation ecosystems and commercialization, and I'm going to ask Marcela to make a comment on this. So we need this triple helix approach. The academia, the innovation community can come up with ideas. They want to commercialize their skills, their dreams, their passions, even their problems. But as Marcela was telling us, there's a host of things you need. You need financing, right? You need networks, right? You need, of course, a market. So what really can help us address this is to have a school-based, university-based, community-based incubation centers or innovation centers. And we have them around actually Africa in many universities, which can help students, researchers, lecturers, other innovators on how to actually go about commercializing their idea, their inventions. Through management skills, how to establish a company, manage it, how to mobilize finances, how to find markets, and how to find mentors, partnerships in industry. So that's why the triple helix is actually about the idea of how you can link up universities, industry, the private sector, banks, financial institutions, within an overarching public policy framework. This would be extremely important to have. And if we can scale this across the continent, including at the local community level, involving local governments, it would be the best way to create jobs, to actually alleviate poverty, address these public policy objectives. So Marcela, do you have a comment to make on this, what I've just said?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mange. I think you've basically taken out most of the things that I wanted to say, but one of the main things that I would want to put out there is if you're looking at the innovators, when you look at the producers in terms of innovators, and that's where we're looking at the collaborative partnerships between the innovators, the research institutions, and the various universities. And then you also have to look at the consumers, because when you're dealing with the innovation, you're either a producer or a consumer. So you find that when you're talking about consumers, it would more be individuals, startups. That's where the medium and micro SMEs basically come in. And then to get all these off the ground, you actually need to have the enablers. And these enablers are they were talking about the incubators and accelerators as well. as well as the, science hubs that we have all over the place. And, we do not have a shortage of all these things. It's just that we are not capitalizing on this particular infrastructure that is there. And I think it's important for us to be able to take advantage. And as I said, anytime you turn up for a science fair or something, a creative forum, you're amazed at how much is coming out. And yet we have not quite put that into play. And of course, there's the issue of financing, and then taking advantage of the disruptive technology. And I think one of the things that you find, like, for instance, big data, you find that quite a number of the producers in terms of the innovation chain take advantage of the big data. So you're able to identify the areas of need and pick out what areas you need to come up with creative and innovative ideas and later commercialize them. So we need to be able to take advantage of all this disruptive technology, more so the big data, and even in terms of commercialization and using the works is probably something like blockchain. So I guess I think from Africa, most of the startups are basically technology based, and they're mainly in the area of fintech. And we need to go beyond just mere discovery, innovation, but to go to now value addition and get more out there in terms of the products that we have. And of course, the market is important. And as I said earlier, I think the market is really big. And I think the AfCFTA protocol on intellectual property, which again does not operate in isolation, because it will work together with the digital trade, investments, competition law, all those protocols, those are very important. And I think as we work towards the annexes to the protocol, we need to ensure that we tailor them to suit our needs as much as we have the international system that deals with it. But we are able to work systems that will work for us. Thank you.
Very much. Exactly. So we need to scale up our startups into global brands, actually, continental brands at least, or regional brands at least. And this is exactly how development will happen. Now, I wanted to ask Bruce, did you want to make an intervention at this juncture? You have been quite active in the chat box. Do you have speaking rights? I hope you do. All right. As you are fixing that, let me just make an intervention on services. There's a question on services. Yes. So following the initiative by the Division of Trade in Goods, which was spearheaded by Director Mohammed, and I was very happy I was honored to co-chair the meetings which led to the launching of this initiative, together with a colleague from the government of Ghana. We've now extended it to trading services. So the next edition, the next iteration of trading services, of the guided trade initiative, which has increased from 7 countries, as Mohammed has told us, to 31. I hope I'm now right. 31 countries which will be participating in the next edition. Trading services will be included. And the meetings are ongoing on how to do the matchmaking between the suppliers of services and, of course, importers, consumers of services, so that we can also demonstrate that you can actually trade in services using the AfCFTA rules, just like we have already demonstrated that you can trade in goods using the AfCFTA rules. Yeah, so that's extremely good. Now, Alan, I can see you're prominently featuring on the screen. I just wanted to turn to you and ask you a question. Movement of persons is very critical, as you said, and as Professor Raj has also told us at the beginning. What can we do at the moment? The protocol on movement of persons is struggling a bit, and you are doing a lot of work to make sure that it's ratified and it enters into force. We hope that will come to fruition soon. But what can we do at the moment? For instance, using the protocol on trading services. In other words, the link between trade and migration. Would you like to say something about this?
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
I'd very much like to say just a couple of words. The time is very short. So I think it's straightforward. So before I get into the protocol on services, which you rightly say is relevant, I want to say that, one of the aspects of it is that between countries there needs to be greater trust in terms of civil registration systems, passport systems, immigration systems, exchange of information on security, exchange of information on criminals, and that sort of thing. And I think that's happening at the moment. There's a lot. I was recently at the Pan-African Forum on Migration, and I was really impressed at the way that some international organizations, including UNECA, the Development Bank, the International Organization for Migration, and others are working with countries that don't have very good systems to improve them and are making really rapid progress. So I think that when, as that happens, the power of the securocrats, because the migration issue often gets securitized, it gets made into a security issue when it really shouldn't be. The power of the securocrats to block the process will be diminished very considerably. But to get to the point about services, in the protocol on trade and services, there is a provision that requires the free movement of skilled persons, basically business people, professionals, in a number of different with a number of different skills, and that and as we know, there is a focus in the trade and services protocol on 5 areas of services initially: business services, financial services, transport, communications, and tourism. Now, I think it's possible to move forward on the movement of skilled persons in those sectors on a continental level, using the momentum created by the African Free Trade Continental Free Trade Agreement, using the force of the Secretariat, because there isn't a similar Secretariat in place in the case of the free movement of persons at a continental level. And that once we've actually achieved the free movement of skilled people to be able to, in those sectors, we will have created this system which allow for that system to be broadened into other service sectors and into sectors beyond service sectors, and ultimately to a much wider range of people. Now, the reason I'm confident about that is that's exactly what happened in South America. It's what happened in the European Union, and it's to some extent in Asia. In all of those regions, the movement of skilled people preceded the movement of all people on a freer basis. And why, when you make those provisions, so for example, in ASEAN, they have a provision for 8 different professional and business sectors, business service people to be able to move across the country, across the region, across borders in the region. You develop systems, you develop documentation systems, you develop forms of trust between different institutions in the different countries involved. And once you've established that and are confident that that's working properly, you can spread that to a much wider group of people. So I think we can learn from South America, the EU, and to some extent ASEAN, although I think we'll go ahead of ASEAN, and move forward on the movement of skilled people first, and then less skilled people. At the same time, there are bilateral labor agreements in many African countries for less skilled people, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for the very substantial improvement of those bilateral labor agreements, which cover the lower skilled people.
Right. Thank you so much. Right. So we have got just 3 minutes left. Bruce, are you now able to speak? Maybe just for 1 minute.
I think that might be a bit of a challenge.
Oh, a problem. All right. Okay. No problem.
Yeah,
right. Think, So anyway, so now in winding up, before I turn the floor back to Rajneesh, allow me to thank all our panelists. I think they have done an excellent job, if you allow me to make an assessment. And I would like to thank all the participants who have made time to be here. I hope you have found this useful. I would like to thank all those who have contributed in the chat box. We've greatly benefited from your ideas and from your questions as well. And of course, I would like to thank Rajneesh. First of all, as a moderator, I think he says he's a skeptic. You say you're a skeptic, but one of these days we are going to make sure you're no longer skeptic with regard to the AfCFTA. This is the second time we're having a go at it. I'm sure next time we shall succeed. Thank you so much always for being so provocative. You bring out all the different dimensions that need to be taken into account. And then, of course, the other aspect of it is to thank you in your capacity as our host, the Dunning Africa Center, for enabling this seminar to take place. It's hugely important and beneficial to all of us. So thank you, and back to you.
Thanks, Francis. And I really want to take this opportunity, first of all, to say, the Dunning Africa Center, the webinar series is about conversations. It's not a place, it's an Africa-wide conversation, a continent-wide conversation. And this is not the last one we're going to do, because as we were speaking, I realized two things that came out of this for me. One is the issue of SMEs and the fact that Africa is is atomistic in structure. It really has to come down to the grassroots. Otherwise, it's not going to take off. Nothing will take off unless we pull the people with us. That's the first thing. The informal sector, 89% of Africa is in the informal sector. It has to move with us. So these are things that need to be dealt with. And we're going to come back to them in the new year. And lastly, the issue I think that really came up is the industrialization issue. I know it's come up a number of the chat functions, is that, the end of the day, we realize that we have to move up the value chain. We cannot be stuck in commodities. This is a long-standing problem in Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to help us move up the value chain. So industrialization, really, all the lessons that we're going here is how to industrialize. At the end of the day, that's what matters. That's what's going to drive the continent forward. And I'm going to propose that we do a special session on this particular topic. How do we move industrialization? No, the AfCFTA is only one aspect of it. There's more going on here. And we need to talk about that, definitely. And, let's have a webinar. People in the audience, you want to take part in this, you want to suggest ways, we'll do a book on it. I'm happy to edit a book on this particular topic. Let's have a webinar. We're going to skip, this is December. I know January 7th the first week of January is not going to be great for a webinar. February, we're up for a webinar. We will be having a new one. I think this is the greatest privilege of my career currently, is making this happen, making people talk about things that they would not ordinarily have a chance to talk. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. The audience, you have been very good about this, listening to us, talking about sometimes esoteric details, but, everybody has contributed, and really just the beginning of the conversation. So thank you, and have a good new year.
Nice. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy New Year, everybody.
Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us on the first Thursday of every month.